Well, what a bad tactical mistake it was to be speaking after him. And also, I have to apologise, I wasn't here right through the entire day. I was actually attending a conference about Caithness and the Nordic dialects. And some of you will think, do you know something, lassie, get your priorities straight. You may know my mother came from Caithness, and I'm quite interested in all matters Nordic. And actually, I think some of these things that are seen as sort of softer aspects of the national debate are the ones that we need to pull very close to us now. Because this is not just a debate about tactics, timing, and those kind of, if you like, some of those brittle things, and I'm not suggesting they're not important, they've been discussed all day. But for those of us who are not in a political party, indeed, if you were to get a bit more to the point, for those of us who are not the three people who are in charge of one political party, those discussions about tactics are irrelevant. We can do very little to affect very much to do with tactics. And what I was thinking when I was listening to Jonathan, and what I completely agree with him about, is this question of removing Britain as a benchmark for anything. I disagree with him, sadly, about the way that Britain is viewed within the rest of the world. Because extraordinarily, and you may find this when you travel about yourselves, extraordinarily, people will describe London or the Westminster as the mother of parliaments still. And you still have to point out that a government currently runs on 37% of the vote and 25% of the electorate, and that's okay. That's our benchmark. We're doing all right because we get a better turnout. It's not enough. And in all the bits of discussion I was hearing, there has been a lot of talk about Jeremy Corbyn and the prospects of something more radical and sensible, bar their views on Scottish independence, coming out of the Corbynistas. And I think the thing is, we can't have this be an either-or. It can't end up being that we're attracting people who want independence, but if you really want some very cutting-edge ideas about democracy, if you really want people whose ambition is to rival the most quasi-socialist states of Europe, if you really want that kind of thing, you need to go somewhere else. We can't have that. And I think that the lack of ambition sometimes, I don't think within this movement, but within some parties, comes from a Britishness within that is simply not recognised and which we have to get shot of. Now, as some of you may know, I can bore for the universe about Nordic countries, but I make no apology for it. Because unless we get to the stage that we have some idea of what we're heading towards, and we can see that these things can be achieved in our lifetimes, with not many dead, in fact not one, with very little in the way of downsides, and with fewer natural resources than Scotland's got, if we can understand some of that, then we can see the way forward. And when Jonathan was talking about the need for a vision, that's what a movement does. It's not what a political party does. A party is an electoral machine. To some degree, it has to be. What a movement needs to do is to keep pushing the ball further up the field, I think, than a political party can afford to go. So this question of trying to fill in that gaps about what kind of democracy would we have in an independent Scotland, that one needs a push from this movement right now. And actually, some of those things may also not sound revolutionary. And again, no apologies. When I think across the Nordic countries and trying to think of the one thing that seems similar about all of them. There is one thing. They already ran their countries before they became independent. And I don't just mean that they had seriously devolved government, not like the kind of patsy stuff that we're told is the most powerful in the world. Seriously, they had seriously powerful local government. And the difference was that a far greater range of people knew what it was to wield power. A far greater number of people had done the talking, done the budgets, made big decisions, seen how they could change the lives of people locally, got used to that, got used to knowing somebody that actually was a councillor. In fact, the state manifests itself at local level. That's why there was no debate in any of the Nordic countries. When independence was on offer, they snatched it with both hands. They had already been running their countries. We have not. And this is the difference I see quite a number of them. That if you look at the various ways that allowed those countries to loup in the last century cleanly away from the mother state, a lot of those are not in place in Scotland. And actually, who was it said that a language is just a dialect with a navy and a state at your back? Well, I don't make an apology for taking language seriously either, because culture is another aspect of what was missed last time round. It's usually what haps folk in to an independence movement. Most independence movements have actually been based on linguistic division. So if we have a few bits missing in the cogs of our wheel, and we do, it's astonishing that we've come as far as we have, with some structural problems that still remain unresolved. And those ones are the lack of local power, the lack of availability of land, therefore the lack of availability and affordability of power. If I go back to Norway again, when they started hydropower, the assumption was hydropower was a community, a common good. So the money that came in from hydropower, and Norway is completely powered by it, it's only Britain that takes their gas and oil. That country had an assumption from the beginning that natural energy assets didn't belong to the chiel on whose ground it was found. And because that template was put in on hydropower in the last century, the oil fund followed exactly the same pattern. Structures matter. Patterns matter, defaults matter, and our default is British. We haven't turned it around very considerably at all yet. But the vision we have to have is that different thing, which with the kind of smedum exhibited by a set of people who just don't understand the meaning of the word no or failure, and that's everybody in this room, because the odds were totally stacked against independence becoming a reality, and still we're here. If we can add that on to some real substantial change that's needed to make Scotland modern, to lose us from any connection with the ancient nonsense that passes for semi-feudal ideas of democracy that exist south of the border, we need to shake ourselves down. We need to liven ourselves up, and we could take a lot from the folk around us who've been doing just that. So I hope that the vision is going to come from here, because I have a fear it's not going to come from other places. And in the tactics and the negotiating, the horse trading, the pondering and the kind of scratching of beards that will happen for the next year till we all meet again, the difference that can be made is our thinking into the future and peopling it, describing it, discussing it, and actually, let's be blunt, pushing the SNP into it. So thank you very much. I've been delighted to be listening on the sidelines of this debate today, hearing very blunt talking, very passionate talking as ever, and seeing a wider age range than practically any political meeting I ever go to. Can I just say in conclusion, if any of you are more interested in learning a little bit about the Brexit side of things as far as the Nordics are concerned, there's a big meeting organised by Nordic Horizons that I organise, which is going to be in Edinburgh. And that's just the final point I want to make. Who knows actually what will happen with Brexit? And I came back from the Faroe Islands 2 weeks ago. Has anyone been to the Faroes? One, right. Well, there's 49,000 people in the Faroe Islands, and they have their own government, they raise their own taxes, they have their own telecoms regulator, they control their own energy, they have the most powerful parliament in the world, I think. And one really significant thing about them, they're waiting on the edge of their seats to find out what Scotland does after Brexit. Because actually, and I voted Remain, they can't understand why we want to remain. They're sitting 49,000 of them with no backup. They're not members of the EU. They're not members of the EEA. They're sitting away off in the North Atlantic on their own, 18 little lumps of rock, and they conduct their own trade negotiations. In fact, they're discussing independence so that they can get a seat at the Arctic Council, a seat at the Nordic Council, a seat at the World Trade Organization. Every different complexion of EU relationship is reflected in that little bunch of Nordic states. Finland is deeply in. It's a member of the EU, it's a member of the Euro. Norway is deeply out. It had 2 referendums, voted to stay out. Denmark is in, but its devolved governments in the Faroes and Greenland are out. And the point is, all that level of diversity, to come back to Jonathan's point again, all that level of national diversity is perfectly able to coexist amongst rational neighbours. And perhaps that's the one thing that we haven't got, although I'll give you that Finland sometimes doesn't have a very rational neighbour beside it. But what we have that difference, and yet we must believe that it's quite possible to have whatever outcome happens and make a good fist of it for Scotland. Because there's every different shade of grey going on just to the east of us, and those countries regularly and tediously top every single achievement level. So the bigger picture is what we're going for, and it has to be the end of a top-down, devil take the hindmost, winner takes all, the average doesn't matter, the elite will fix us, trickle-down nonsense that I've been birthed into, and I want to excise from my life. I'm convinced there's a lot of us want to do the same. Thank you.